Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everybody, or at least everybody who is in the same time zone. First of all, I want to thank very much FFWD to have given me the opportunity to speak to all of you today. I also think that we need to thank very much all the people who allow us forced teleworkers to continue to live more or less normally, and to all these health workers who are now grappling on the first line of the fight against the coronavirus these days around the world. So I will speak today in my personal capacity, just to share with you a few insights that I've been able to gather, and trying to share what my understanding of a few things around my experience at the European Commission. So we've seen a number of people, being disappointed by the fact that foresight was there in the case of COVID-19, but obviously many people have still been taken by surprise. We've even seen a couple of countries actually reducing their capacity to address pandemics, shortly before this happened. And so I think that we have to draw a few lessons for us foresight professionals. I assume that most of you listening to this are foresight professionals. And what can we do to either repair or strengthen the ability of foresight to influence policy making? What are the right practices that we should use? So I think that today we're all together in this. We are among colleagues and among friends sometimes. We are all eager to look towards the future. Now is a moment for togetherness. Now is a moment for collective reflection for us, foresight professionals, to look towards what we can do for building a better world after this pandemic. Our role as foresight professionals is quite important. And I believe that rather than being tellers of nice, interesting stories, our role is more that of being a pebble in the shoe. We should be the people who help decision makers face potentially discomforting realities, to face uncertainty, to face possibly scaring futures, but in a way that the policymakers actually want to listen to us. It's not so easy. So here we have a bit of an image of a utopia, but that's just to express the fact that in this context, it's really vital that us foresight community not be perceived as a detached elite in their ivory tower, possibly advising policymakers who are also in their ivory tower, either in perceived self-isolation to protect themselves from the virus, or perceived as being disconnected from the realities of the world. So it's clear that the knowledge about foresight on pandemics was there. For sure, we've had a century or more of than a century of pandemics. A few years ago, we even had Bill Gates, telling us in a TED talk, what had to be done to prepare for pandemics. So what happened? So what happened is that not only were many warnings ignored by most people, but also a blame game has started to appear. In Europe in particular, what we've seen is a number of national narratives that have emerged, and then the blame being very quickly directed towards the European Union. In the US, we saw President Trump trying to blame China, okay? But blame games are really useless, and they are really a distraction from concrete, positive, constructive action that we should take to actually move forward. So what can we do to ensure that we learn from this experience and actually find a way to provide the best possible evidence for policy making? The action that needs to be taken today needs to serve us all. We have to create a collective future which is possible for all of us. How do we do that? How do we make sure that the insights generated by foresight actually do serve policy making? Are there tools that we can apply to reduce the distance between the sources of knowledge and the decision making that is done by political decision makers? What are the boxes that we should tick to be able to do this? I'm using this cartoon to break a bit the ice and also introduce an interesting point. I'm going to read what Calvin and Hobbes were saying back in 1992. When I grow up, I'm not going to read the newspaper, and I'm not going to follow complex issues, and I'm not going to vote. That way, I can complain that the government doesn't represent me. Then, when everything goes down the tubes, I can say that the system doesn't work and justify my further lack of participation. Well, that's an ingeniously self-fulfilling plan. Well, it's a lot more fun to blame things than to fix them. Okay? I think this describes very well the paradigm we're in. And it's a lot easier to blame things than to do something to fix them. And we've seen that this has happened around this pandemic, especially in Europe. And the danger about this is that this is giving a lot of fodder to populist politicians. So instead of this, how can we make sure that we build a future that everybody is part of, in which everybody feels that they contribute? So here in this image, we see a traditional Catalan exercise, which is a human tower, where we see that even those at the edge contribute to the stability of the overall edifice. You know, it's everybody is in there. And this human tower could be a metaphor for the EU, with the rest of the world possibly looking in admiration. See, here we have collective action serving a vision, and blame games actually prevent this kind of things from happening. You know, they very often use selective evidence to sow discord. So we should not be blaming. So how can we make sure that the best possible evidence is used in policy making? We see that today this is being challenged. You know, Donald Trump is a perfect example of how evidence is dismissed. Evidence or lack of evidence is feeding polarization. Disinformation is being used right, left, and center to destabilize countries. So a new reflection is needed about how to strengthen knowledge brokerage, a function that foresight should have between science and policy. Foresight is steeped in knowledge, it's steeped in reason, and it's steeped in collective intelligence. Okay, and we believe that a better understanding of human behavior can actually help put this knowledge and this reason at the heart of policymaking. Recent work at the European Commission's Joint Research Center has put together powerful new insights from the behavioral and social sciences, as well as from humanities, to update our understanding on human political behavior. And this knowledge, we believe, can actually contribute to bring insights from foresight to policymakers. Emotions, values, identity, reason are all things that affect the way we think and the way we take decisions which are relevant for policy. We all know, especially in the field of foresight, that many paths can lead us to a future, and that many futures can be chosen from. The role of policymaking is to take action today to create the future we desire, okay? But which future? How to ensure that this future benefits us all? Have alternatives been considered? Have alternative paths been investigated? This is something that we do in the face of complexity. Whether it is about this pandemic, we're all in the world connected. Whether it's about climate disruption, there's an enormous amount of connectedness and complexity behind this. If we look at how industrial supply chains are being disrupted, these are very complex systems that we have to deal with, wherever they are. So how can we do something about this? We believe that science can help us redesign the way policymakers work to take better decisions and to prevent policy mistakes. So foresight professionals have long known through their practice that collective intelligence works. And there is now very solid scientific evidence that is underpinning this empirical knowledge. This scientific evidence can help us redesign the way policymakers work together to take better decisions and to prevent policy mistakes. So the report and the work summarizing all this scientific evidence is called Understanding Our Political Nature. It was published last year, and it is making 6 very powerful points. The first one is about misperception and disinformation. We all know that this is used to disrupt the policymaking process. It must be addressed if we want to have better policymaking. Foresight, scenario building, these very many tools that foresight applies are actually powerful to avoid and address misperceptions. Collective intelligence, I was just mentioning, is also known to be very important to improve policymaking. Thinking collectively can significantly improve the quality of political decisions, but only if these collective processes are well designed. Foresight tools know how to do this. It's very important. Emotions. Many foresight tools actually use emotions to foster understanding. We now know, thanks to science, that understanding emotions can also help very much improve the quality of political decision making. Values are extremely important to create a common future and to engage in political decision making that addresses the values and concerns of the citizens. Foresight professionals understand very well the central role of values in thinking about the future. We just have to look at the famous Steve V framework for thinking. Framing, metaphors, narratives are also things that are very much used in policymaking and also very much used in foresight work, especially around scenario building. Trust and openness are also vital to ensure a healthy and good quality political decision making. And we also know that psychological safety is essential for the sharing of critical information, ideas, questions, and address dissenting opinions. The safe space created by scenarios and by other foresight techniques, such as serious games sometimes, are also able to foster the establishment of trust and openness for better discussion of policy issues. These are all points where foresight is already strong, and foresight can actually very much contribute to better policymaking. Now, how can this help in improving the quality of evidence-informed policymaking? This last point is maybe the one where foresight needs to do a bit of homework. How can the outcome of foresight exercises be routinely considered as evidence for policymaking? We've seen that very often. It is not. What is needed for that to happen? What should we do? How can foresight literacy be promoted and improved among policymakers? Well, here I think I have a little bit of good news to bring, at least from the perspective of the European Commission, because the European Commission is now including anticipation in the new set of skills for policymaking that it will soon start to train its staff on. So this new model for political decision making is absolutely human-centered. This has already been clear to many people. The future has to take a human-centric approach and not so much of an economic-centric approach. But that requires the listening to and considering all the mental and physical signals, both of the policymakers and of the citizens. Interaction, co-creation, production, these are very essential approaches that we need to apply to be able to address the complexity that we're facing. And this complexity is also making clear that no single mind, how brilliant it may be, can solve all the issues that we must tackle. Collective intelligence is the way forward. And while this might be novel in some circles, interaction, co-creation, collaboration, co-production, etc., have long been familiar in the field of foresight. What we must insist on today, even more than ever before, is inclusiveness and participation. We heard earlier in this conference that the need for foresight to be linked to the top. I would argue that this might be even more important, or what would be more important, is to make sure that the top is more inclusive in its collection of evidence and is more daring to engage more effectively with citizens. Most of you are foresight professionals, and you know that we do have many tools at our disposal that can actually help reduce the distance between stakeholders and citizens, citizens and policymakers, whomever is relevant. And these tools can also help all these people engage in more systemic reflections with a long-term perspective. So here I'm just showing you a few pictures of the tools that we have developed and that we use at the EU Policy Lab of the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. So together with others, we can rely on a broad palette of know-how to innovate in policymaking. The path is long and a culture change is still needed, both in the European Commission and elsewhere, but we are starting to see some shifts happening, and that's really bringing us hope. Citizen engagement is really an important aspect of making sure that future policymaking really creates a future that will be beneficial for all. Engagement with citizens is something that takes place already on a routine basis. However, very often this applies around specific issues, whether it is about air pollution here, or biodiversity, or any sort of very focused discussion, local sometimes. What we need to do is to allow citizen engagement to reach an additional higher scale, bringing more people into the picture to actually bring their input. And a new exercise is being prepared at European level to reflect on the future of Europe. It's called the Conference on the Future of Europe. I believe that it is our collective responsibility as foresight professionals to make sure that this exercise applies the best possible futures know-how. To finish, is COVID-19 the sign of a failure of foresight to influence policymaking? Well, I don't think we can bring a final definite answer to this, but foresight definitely seems to have had some successes. You know, some countries have had the opportunity to apply the lessons from past pandemics to respond well. You know, Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, some people have had very good successes. However, it's clear that other places haven't managed to do that. So we need to improve. So if I refer back to this new model for political decision making based on the most recent science, so we've seen that foresight clearly ticks the first 6 boxes. But how can foresight become a standard input for evidence-informed policy making? Okay. Based on my experience from the last few years working where I have been working, I think that there are a few key points that should be brought out. I think that foresight to influence policy should from the onset be performed with a clear policy making purpose in mind. I've seen many foresight exercises being run, you know, which were very interesting, but more exploratory, and this is fine. It can stimulate discussion, but it doesn't have much impact in terms of policy making. Also, foresight must be inclusive of all the relevant participants from the onset. Only then can the robustness of the political decision making that takes place after the foresight exercise actually be improved. I've also seen, and I've been engaged in foresight exercises that could have been qualified as quick and dirty. You know, there's a deadline, we have to do something by then, let's do something quickly. And very often it gives something interesting, but it's not good enough to actually influence the political decision making. So we really have to execute foresight according to the best professional standards from the beginning. Also, very often the requests that we get are very much put into a particular frame, a particular moment with specific types of people. So my experience is that foresight is most successful in its capacity to influence political decision making when it is able to adapt to very specific demands from the customer. And that requires very often engaging very much with the customer to create together, you know, the tailoring, the specific circumstances that will be needed to serve the purpose at that moment. And then I think last but not least, I think it's important to consider that foresight should not be always performed separately as a foresight exercise, but also be embedded in other projects and in other types of work, which is performed on a more routine basis for policy making. So this is all I wanted to say to you today, and I'm now available for discussion. A question about design for policy. You mentioned that the road is still long, but you're starting to see some shifts happening, which give hope. Can you give a few examples of this? Yes. Thank you, Barbara. What I will say is that we in the Commission have started to develop toolkits and approaches that are becoming more and more popular in our policymaking colleagues in order to actually develop a more visual approach to engaging in futures thinking. And this has been applied to many different topics. One recent one is the social economic canvas, for example. We've engaged in a lot of game design activities. We've engaged in a lot of canvas use for scoping studies. We're designing serious games. So this is something that we apply more and more, and where a lot of creativity is actually being deployed. Are organizations that have been focusing very hard on evidence-based policy able to incorporate foresight tools easily? How do they reconcile the two approaches organizationally? Well, this is a very interesting question, and this is really in the place where we are actually working. We are both at the Joint Research Center working at providing data into the policymaking process, that's for sure. But we're also trying to develop this kind of know-hows, toolboxes, you know, designed for policy approaches, which are designed to help the standard policymaking work include the foresight approaches more than before. We are currently engaged in contributing to what people call the better regulation toolbox, which is being developed at EU level, where we are now injecting foresight tools and foresight approaches as standard tools in policy making. So this is only early days, but I hope that this will now actually develop quickly. What is my vision on effective citizen engagement in terms of effective large-scale execution? I'm not an expert in this, but I've seen colleagues of mine who've started to do this. It's extremely powerful. It is extremely enriching. My impression is that the high-level decision makers are still too reluctant and too afraid of doing this. Sometimes I have the impression that these people are afraid of the uncertainty because they don't know what the citizens will actually say. Sometimes there are difficult questions that come up, and so there is a fear that has to be overcome. So I really think that people have to dare more to engage with citizens, and there are tools that can actually help manage, the difficult discussions that appear sometimes in citizen engagement. So I really think that it is a know-how that has to be developed in democratic societies. So policymakers may not be very interested in foresight efforts. So how do we break through this resistance? Well, by being tirelessly coming back with our calls for openness, for engagement, and also by being very professional so that we can actually show quality outcomes from foresight processes. I was personally involved recently in a foresight process on the future of customs in Europe. And here, because we've had very good engagement from our customer, people have been actually very surprised by the added value that engaging with us in these kind of processes has brought. And people understood that a lot of the added value is not so much, whatever scenarios you produce at the end, but very often it is the community of interest that you create by including the stakeholders from the start together in a foresight exercise. When you make people reflect together for the long term on, your foresight exercise, you leave your current agenda at home because you start to think together about the future, which does not exist yet. And so people are more open-minded and create collaboration mechanisms more easily than when they are defending their business today. So this is really a lesson I think that was, learned, let's say, from our policymaking colleagues. I think the point, about the willingness of the politicians to listen to futurists is not so much this. It's not that the futurists have to say something and that the politicians on the other end have to listen to what the futurists say. I think this should be more going towards what I was saying earlier, where the futurists and the policymakers should actually engage together in joint processes of collective intelligence, so that it's not the foresight professionals who tell the politicians what to do, because that's not their role. The politicians have their responsibilities to take, and they have to take into account a lot of evidence coming from many different circles. What the foresighters and the futurists should do is to actually help the politicians strengthen their thinking and broaden their space for strategic reflection so that they can take, in the end, a better decision. It's not a matter of making the politicians, listen more to what the futurists have to say. So how do we connect this work at the EC with what national or even regional or diverse policymaking settings are doing? Yes, it's difficult to avoid being in the Brussels bubble. And so what we try to do is to actually invite as many of the relevant stakeholders as possible in our foresight processes from the onset. And we are ready to actually help people financially to do that, join us, to think together, to be able to actually get out of the Brussels bubble. Now, this is never easy just because of the physical distance. So I'm now actually interested to see what this forced confinement and this explosion of online engagement, with lots of people actually can do to help us engage more easily with a wider range of people. So this is something where, some more development has to be done. So how do we educate stakeholders and the average citizen on the value of foresight? I think it's by being open, by being welcoming, by being humble, by not over-promising, by being able to tell people that we are completely incapable to predict what is going to happen, and that foresight is not about predicting the future, but it's about showing people that they are actually involved in some form of anticipation in their daily life without even realizing, and that showing them that some of our tools can actually be very useful to help them grasp their own future better, realize better how much agency that they have, and understand how to sail around challenges that can come up in the future. It's really a culture change which is never going to happen very quickly, and I think that this education is going to be much more an education by example and by engagement than an education by formal trainings, if I can speak like this. So yes, there's one more. Mejdi Sahrawi. Should foresight thinking be not considered as solid evidence-based tools for policymakers? Yes, that's exactly my point. I think that the outcome of proper foresight processes should be considered as valid evidence for policymaking, okay? Because policymakers have to take into account a very broad range of evidence, some very solid, some not solid at all, coming from all kinds of perspectives. And helping policymakers understand foresight would actually allow them to consider the outcomes of collective intelligence processes as a relatively robust form of knowledge that should definitely be taken into account for policy making. So that's something we are working on, but I think that this is going to be going slowly because it requires an important change of culture. But we are really up there trying to make that happen through the various tools that we are actually able to manipulate and use across the Commission. What is the greatest risks that we face if we do not use foresight more effectively? Well, I think the greatest risk that we face is the risk of data-based policy. And if you based your policy making strictly on monitoring and hardcore indicator systems, what you actually do is the same as if you were driving your car by constantly looking into the rear view mirror rather than looking through the windshield. Because what you do when you look through the windshield is to anticipate constantly. What you do if you always, use the data that you have, if you use, your dashboard, how much petrol you have left in the tank, how much or how fast are you going and things like that. Most likely you're not going to go very far. But very often, in the very quantitative based policy making that we tend to do, actually this reinforces this looking back rather than looking forward. So that's a bit how I would interpret this. Are there other regions also working on a policy making level with futures thinking other than Europe? I'm not very knowledgeable about this. I've heard a lot about Singapore, for example, being a very classic example of this, where futures thinking is really embedded in policy making. But I'm really no expert to talk about this. I think that John Sweeney, who was talking before me, would probably be a better expert for this. Regarding the work on better regulation, how does foresight then link with impact assessment and evaluation? So this is something that we're starting with because very often impact assessment is very steeped in quantitative models, which are very often reduced to economic modeling. And so earlier this year, earlier this year, we were in a workshop at the European Parliament where we were explaining how foresight and scenario work in particular could actually be used to improve impact assessment, or for what some people call the stress testing of policies, meaning trying to understand beforehand the potential impacts that specific policies could have into the future. So yes, this is something we are working on, but we are still very much at early days. What about evaluation of foresight exercises? That's a very, very difficult question. I've heard, the talk by this person from Nesta earlier, who was also saying that evaluating the impact of foresight exercises is very difficult, because the impacts are very often multiple, they are diffuse, they can be also long-term. So we don't have a foresightometer, I'd say. I wish we could, but so far, I've not really found very strong work on these kind of things. What we do where I work is really very much to rely on anecdotal evidence, the feedback from the people we work for, more than anything else. And also the feedback from the people we involve in our foresight exercises, because they can tell us what they learned. But then we discover that there is a lot of diffuse impact, which then we never hear about, because all the participants get something from the exercise and then they go back to their homes and to their work, and they don't tell us what they got from having worked with us. So we hear back and forth a few anecdotes coming back, but that's really very difficult. Randy Wolken, foresight is very exciting, but often not used by local and regional policymakers. If we wanted to start this at a local level, where do you recommend we begin? I think that's a very good point. And foresight is actually often very easy to use. Something that I have practiced myself is through the application of a tool that we developed a couple of years ago together with John Sweeney, which is called the Scenario Exploration System. It is a serious game that allows people in a couple of hours to really engage in depth with scenarios and with the long-term future, but in a way that makes the scenarios refer to the specific issues they're interested in. Okay, so that brings the scenario close to them and their specific concerns. And so I think that's a very nice way to introduce foresight to people who have never, heard about it. And that because it's a tool that actually helps discuss specific topics that people are interested in, it's a nice way to begin, as an introduction. And once you've done that, then you can introduce the scenario building that you need to actually create that tool, upstream. And that can be a nice introduction into the world of foresight. So how do we educate stakeholders? And how do you contribute to COVID with foresight? Do you plan any project? I think foresight is not so much, now we are in the crisis response phase. So I think that, it's not really the time for foresight for this right now. What we are trying to do with a number of colleagues is to engage people in thinking long-term after this shock. That's where foresight is probably most useful. Do we plan any projects? Yes, we're starting to build some projects. We're starting to influence the exercise on the reflection on the future of Europe. And so, but this is still very much in early days. So the tool you just discussed, this sounds wonderful. Okay, well, I think that the best is you Google scenario exploration system. You make an internet search on this and you will find some of our web pages where we describe the tool. Otherwise, it's very easy. You can contact me personally and I will send you all the relevant information. So how do we engage with people without the filter of EU policy? Well, that's the challenge I was mentioning a bit earlier. You know, we have to dare to engage in an open fashion. And I think we have a lot of tools that allow us to actually do that. And we have tools that help people understand the complexities that policymakers are facing and to avoid getting into this easy blame game. So I really think that some of the tools, and including the scenario exploration system that we have at our disposal, can actually help get these filters out. And thank you again to everybody for having given me this opportunity and having listened to me.